Okay, we are back. So let me share my screen with you and we will carry on talking about circulatory systems. And just because I just got an email question about this, I'll just say again regarding the midterm that you are only responsible for the material in the chapters that we covered in lecture. And let me say that again more clearly. So even for the chapters that are listed up here as being part of the midterm, you are only responsible for the material in those chapters that we covered in lecture. So for example, chapter 50, we just focused on sensory systems. We didn't talk about the muscular system and movement. And the same is true in this chapter. We're just focusing basically on the cardiovascular system and not on the pulmonary system, okay? So hopefully no surprises. Okay, so in the second part of the lecture, we are going to focus exclusively on mammals and primarily on humans. And so to bring you back to where we were, this is kind of the last time you'll see a simple diagram of the cardiovascular circuit. And so we have mammals, we have double circulation and a 4-chambered heart, right? And in the next slide, I'll show you a figure that is a bit more complicated. It's going to show you the same thing as the one here, but it's got a lot more arrows and parts to it. And when I start to look at figures like that, I just kind of like get overwhelmed. So I thought that maybe you guys are all good, but I'm not. So I thought I would go through it first on this simpler figure, and basically we're gonna track the blood going through the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Okay, so here we go. So blood always enters the heart via the atria, whether on the right side or on the left side, and then blood is always pumped out of the heart via the ventricles, again, whether on the right or the left. Okay, so, and again, this is left and right from the heart's owner's perspective, not from yours looking at the figure, right? It is reversed. Okay, and so here we go. We get blood being brought to the heart from the lungs, oxygenated blood, and then it's pumped out. Well, yeah, okay, we're tracking its progress. It's going into the left atrium, and then it's going to get pumped out of the left ventricle out to the systemic circuit. And there it goes, and then it's going to, the blood carrying the oxygen's going to diffuse in the systemic capillaries, and then the deoxygenated blood is going to be returned to the heart via the veins, right? And this is going to get sent back into the right atrium this time and into the right ventricle, and then it's going to go back out to the pulmonary circuit to pick up more oxygen. Okay, so I presented this in this very simple version, and it's kind of like a thing that happens in order, but in fact, both of these circuits are working simultaneously. All right, so here's the more complicated figure, and this is where, you know, to me, I just kind of look at this like it's like looking at a, you know, giant highway interchange. And again, I've provided you with this, I don't know why I chose this. This is somewhat disturbing. It seems to be like a human-alien hybrid that has our circulatory system. But regardless, even aliens have left and right. That refers to their own left and their own right. So the left side of their heart is, in fact, on the left side of their body and on our right when we are facing it. All right, so here we go. And this is a figure, these are all from your textbook, but there's extra text that's associated with this figure, and I encourage you to kind of read through it, and it's kind of goes through it point by point in the main text. And another thing to point out to you is that I am not going to ask you about the specific names of veins and arteries. All I want you to know is that arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, and veins are bringing it back to the heart. But I've left these terms on there, but I'm not going to ask you about the specific names on the exam. Okay, ready? Here we go. Okay, so everything starts in the atria, right? So blood is coming into the atria on the right side from the systemic circuit, it's deoxygenated, and on the left side from the pulmonary circuit. These are the lungs out here. Okay, and then it's going to go down into the ventricles on the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And from there, it is going to be actively pumped out into, from the right side, the pulmonary circuit, right? So it's deoxygenated, it's going to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. And then on the left side, it's going out to the systemic circuit. And it's the deoxygenated blood is arriving in the lungs and getting oxygen, and that's all very great. And then kind of there's a slight delay between when blood arrives from the left side of the heart in the capillaries in the head and forelimbs, and then shortly thereafter in the capillaries in the bottom half of the body. And then from there, you're going back via veins to the heart, right? So deoxygenated blood coming from the top of the body and from the bottom of the body. And whoa, that's it. Okay. Yeah, so I guess at that point we are back in the atria, and then we start this whole process over again. Okay. And so, you know, I might ask you something about the specific sequence of all of these events, but one of the main things that are in just really simple terms that I want you to get is that the oxygenated blood from the lungs is coming into the left side of the heart, deoxygenated blood going out from the right side of the heart, and these two systems are operating simultaneously. Okay. So to take a little closer look at the heart, this is kind of a sliced away schematic of a heart. And what the purpose of this is to kind of look at the relative muscle thickness in the atria relative to the ventricles. And so this stuff is representing cardiac muscle, which, if you remember, is the third type of muscle. There's skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, which is quite unique, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, but the relative thickness corresponds to basically the force of contraction that's necessary for each of these four chambers. And so both of the atria, both on the right and left, are pretty thin walled in terms of their cardiac muscle. And so their contraction, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is brief and not nearly as strong as the contraction of the ventricles. And then both ventricles, left and right, pump the same volume of blood during contraction, but the left side that's taking oxygenated blood out to the systemic circuit contracts more forcefully than the right side that's taking it back to the pulmonary circuit. And this is reflected again by the sort of asymmetry in the width of muscle that's shown in this cutaway. It's much wider in the left relative to the right ventricle. Okay. All right, so the cardiac cycle, it refers to just one complete sequence of pumping and filling and sending blood back out. And there are two terms associated with it. So systole refers to the contraction phase, which is the pumping phase, the active phase of the cardiac cycle, and then diastole refers to the relaxed phase, which, you know, it's not pumping, right? And so this is a complete cardiac cycle in an adult human at rest. And so these, you know, the whole thing corresponds to other mammals as well, but the timing reflects the human timing. And so if you were exercising, this would all happen a lot faster, but at rest, it's about 0.8 seconds for one complete cycle. Okay, so we're gonna go through these three figures one at a time. Okay, so and obviously where we decide the cycle starts is fairly arbitrary because it is constant, we hope. But we start here. So this is the phase where the basically both atria and ventricles are relaxed. So this is diastole, and this is when the blood, both from the systemic circuit that's deoxygenated and from the pulmonary circuit that's oxygenated, is flowing into the atria. And so no contraction is taking place, and it's flowing naturally from the atria into the ventricles. Okay. And then there's a very brief atrial contraction, and this is atrial systole. And the purpose of this is to empty the last of the blood out of the atria into the ventricles before the ventricles contract to send it out to the pulmonary and systemic circuits. Okay, that's very brief. And then the main contraction is for the ventricles, and so this is ventricular systole, and at this point the atria are relaxed. Again, they're getting blood back from the systemic circuit and from the pulmonary circuit, but it's the ventricles that are pumping the blood out actively to the pulmonary and systemic circuits. Okay, so that is the cardiac cycle. All right. I've said like repeatedly in this course, this is one of my favorite topics. And so just so you know, I was being honest about all that. Like, honestly, this isn't one of the things that excites me most. I'm not a physiologist, but not the one thing. You have to remain excited. The thing that I particularly find most interesting about the cardiac cycle is the fact that basically that it's maintained. I mean, that's sort of one of our definitions of life. There are many definitions of life, but one of them is the heart beating, right? And so it just carries on. And what's unusual about cardiac muscle is that it contains these cells that are called autorhythmic, meaning that they are maintaining their own rhythm. They have their own drum to which they march, and they contract and relax without direct input from the central nervous system. And so this is why I've never done this in a lab. Maybe, I don't know, we still do this in physiology labs. I think, like, you dissect a frog, you euthanize it humanely, but you know, it's recently dead, and you take out the heart, and the heart will continue pumping for some time. And this is reflecting the activity of these cells that can persist independently of input from the central nervous system, or in the case of a dissected heart, like anything at all. All right, and so there are these two nodes that are critical for coordinating this autorhythmic activity. And the first one is kind of the main coordinator of this, and this is called the sinoatrial node, the SA node. And this is what is referred to as the pacemaker of the heart, because literally it's setting the pace for muscle contractions. And so this is what is replaced in individuals that have a medically placed pacemaker. And so both of these nodes of autorhythmic cells are in the right atrium. And I'll show you a diagram of all this in a moment, but I'm just giving you the text first. And so the sinoatrial node is in the right atrium, and this coordinates the atrial contraction. And then there's a second node also in the right atrium that basically causes the electrical activity in the heart to pause very briefly, I mean, it's not like stopping the heart. So what it does is it delays the contraction of the ventricles until all of the blood has left the atria to make circulation more efficient. And the signals from this node are propagated via these specialized nerve fibers that I'll show you in the next figure. Okay, so here we go. This is what we were just talking about. And so if you've ever had an electrocardiogram done, this is what is being measured. And so we'll walk through this like in terms of what's going on with electrical activity in the heart. But what you see down below is kind of the readout from an ECG. And so this is on the y-axis that isn't provided. This is the amount of electrical activity over time on the x-axis. Okay, so, and then here are these two nodes in the right atrium. All right, so here we go. So in this first part of the figure, and in all cases, the electrical signals are represented in yellow. So this is the spreading of the electrical signal from the SA node through the atria, causing the atria on both sides, and this is all occurring on both sides of the heart, regardless of the fact that the nodes are just in the right side, causes them to contract, right? And then the activity at this node, the AV node, is what causes this very brief delay in ventricular contraction. And so what this does is, I just said, is it allows all the blood coming from the atria into the ventricles on both sides to empty in there before the ventricular contraction. And so then the electrical activity spreads through the down the sides of the ventricles and to the base of the heart, which is called the apex. You don't need to worry about that. And then finally the ventricles contract. And so this is the spreading of electrical signals through the ventricles, pumping the blood out to the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. Okay. And then looking at the actual readout down below, again, there are 3 peaks here. And so the first peak reflects the moderate electrical activity that's associated with atrial contraction. And then there's this brief phase where there's a drop in electrical activity. This is not the same thing as diastole. That is not shown here. But it's this very brief pause generated by the AV node while the blood empties into the ventricles, and then the electrical activity starts to spread. And the big spike in this is the electrical activity associated with the ventricles contracting. And then what's not shown in this figure, if you notice, there's 1, 2, 3 kind of increases in electrical activity, and this reflects the repolarization of the ventricles getting ready for the next contraction. So after all this is when diastole is occurring, and then the next cycle is going. Okay, so that is what is being measured if you get an electrocardiogram. Okay, second, blood pressure. Again, this is something that you have doubtlessly had measured. It seems like it's like impossible to go to the doctor, right? Now they like weigh you, and sometimes they look at your height, and if you're my age, you find that you weigh about the same, but somehow you've shrunk, and that's very disappointing. And then they stick a cuff on your arm, and you just kind of sit there and wait while it like contracts and expands, and then you get some number. Okay, well, you may know all this stuff already, but this number means something. Surprise! All right, and so blood pressure is, in general terms, is just a measure of the force that's exerted by the blood as it flows through the arteries, moving away from the heart, right? And with increasing pressure, it expands the elastic walls of the arteries more. And so blood pressure is highest during ventricular contraction. So this, in terms of blood pressure measurements, is what is referred to as systolic pressure. And then it's lowest when the ventricles are relaxed, and this is diastolic pressure. And it's always, as I showed you before, higher in the systemic circuit than in the pulmonary circuit. And we're not worrying about systolic pressure due to atrial contraction here, because it's really minimal compared to the pressure from ventricular contraction. Okay, yes, and then if you get your blood pressure measured, you're told some number, whether there's a larger number over a smaller number, and this is the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure. All right, so here we go. So back in the day, people were like, doctors or nurses were actually listening and counting, but now there's a machine that does everything automatically. But so you're sitting, and your arm where the cuff is right basically at the level of your heart, and the cuff inflates, right? And exactly at the point when the force of the force of the cuff is basically cutting off your circulation very briefly, right? And so the machine responds precisely to when that point when it's actually cut off the circulation, and then it starts to relax very slightly. And so as at the first point where there's blood that's just able to come through to the other side of the cuff through the artery is when systolic pressure is measured. And so this is the higher number, right? This reflects the higher pressure. And then diastolic pressure is measured as, the cuff inflates, and then you feel it deflate just a tiny bit, and this is systolic pressure. And then it'll slowly start to deflate some more. And then diastolic pressure is measured at exactly the point where the cuff is exerting no pressure on the artery, just at that point when, it hasn't completely deflated, but it's no longer changing the pressure of blood that's flowing through, the part of the artery that's covered by the cuff. And that is diastolic pressure. And so in this individual, their blood pressure would be 120/70, which is a nice healthy blood pressure to have. Okay, so this is a list of things you should know from this chapter that we have just spent this one lecture on. And so once again, you only need to know the things that are the topics that we have talked about in this lecture. You do need to read the textbook. It's fairly detailed on this stuff. And as always, I'm not going to pull out things I haven't talked about, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't read the details in the textbook of the things that I have talked about, because it will give you a firmer grasp of all of this. Okay, guys, and so this is my last lecture with you guys, and this has all been very weird for me. I think I've said several times that, I haven't enjoyed this very much, just because I haven't gotten to interact with you guys very much, and that's really what I enjoy most about teaching. Like, there's no real satisfaction in sitting here and talking to my computer, but I've done my best to maintain some kind of connection with you guys, because from my perspective, that is what is missing. And it's been very nice getting to meet, unfortunately, the minority of you in office hours. But, from here on in, Dr. Reddick will take over again through the rest of the course, and he will take you through the wonderful world of plants. And so if you have specific questions about the materials covered in the last part of the course, you should most certainly talk to Dr. Reddick, not me. But nonetheless, I encourage you, if you want to stop by in my office hours. I'm still going to have them. And whatever, listen to my dogs bark. And so this is, again, we've been joined by my dogs, at least in terms of hearing them many times. And so this is Tulip, who is actually the best behaved of my dogs with her new Stuffy. And to say sorry about all the barking, and good luck on the midterm. I know you guys will do fine. You've hung in there so far, and I know you can make it to the end. Okay, I will see you on Monday at the